alcoholics are 60 to 120 times more likely to commit suicide. But that's actually not what I want to talk about today. I recently found out a friend from high school, as well as one from college, had succumbed to suicide. And, I was talking to a friend who said, what could be so bad that you could do that? And there was a time I thought suicide was such an incredibly selfish act. I've since learned otherwise. But it was when a friend had said that I thought, I think there's a connection between what I talk about in terms of the compulsion to drink and the compulsion to commit suicide. And in the case of drinking, I say it's the constant battle in the brain between the prefrontal cortex, where all the rational thought takes place, versus the midbrain, or the limbic system, as it's called, that's responsible for survival and essentially has, no free thought or willpower. And when we get a craving, essentially that frontal cortex shuts down and we're left at the mercy of the midbrain that compels us to drink. And, sure enough, I Googled and it, confirmed that for individuals who are at risk of suicide, there are significant changes and dysregulation in the frontal cortex. That controls impulses, decision-making, and emotional regulation. So first, I've learned that there's a term for that battle in the brain, and that is limbic friction. And that occurs when those two systems are out of balance. So when the limbic system, that's very emotional, essentially overpowers the logical prefrontal cortex. So when anxiety or fear takes over, the emotional response from the midbrain, the limbic system, can make it difficult to think clearly, problem solve, or make decisions. So again, the frontal cortex is essentially overridden. So it again made me think when my friend said, what could drive someone to do that, was like people that say, what could drive someone to drink and drive with a 2-year-old in the car, as happened recently in the news. And I explain how it really becomes a compulsion, essentially an out-of-body experience. Not true out-of-body when you're looking down on yourself, but where almost more like hypnosis, where you're doing it, but you can't prevent it. All alcoholics can relate to saying, I'm never going to drink again. And then the next thing they know, they're at the liquor store again that day. And I've been through it so many times, and I know I shouldn't be there. I know it ultimately might kill me. We talk about drinking is slow suicide for a lot of us, but I still do it. And I do believe it's a very similar compulsion in the case of suicide, where their mental health deteriorates to the point of just dire hopelessness. And, the cortex is so damaged, the rational thinking just goes out the window. And that absolutely happens in the case of depression, which a lot of, suicidal people are. The emotional weight of sadness, irritability, or hopelessness just overwhelms the frontal cortex, the cortex's ability to engage in positive thinking or problem solving, so just rational thinking just goes out the window. And, in case of drinking, I've likened it to you spend 5 days in the desert and without water, and someone offers you a bottle of it, but tells you you're going to lose everything. Everybody would do the same thing. You would take the water, except the difference in these cases is you haven't spent 5 days in the desert without water. You're just under that illusion. In the case of drinking, because of the brainwashing from being under the spell of alcohol, or in the case of suicide, it's from being under the spell of what's ever causing those suicidal thoughts. So in that moment, it becomes a compulsion on par with as if you really have been in the desert for 5 days, and you or anyone is going to take that water regardless of the repercussions. And again, a compulsion means an irresistible urge to behave in a certain way, especially against one's conscious wishes. Contrary to what many people think, most people with suicidal thoughts desperately want to live. I mentioned hypnosis, which I've never been under, but I Googled, one guy said he was up on stage. The hypnotist said they were going to treat cocktail napkins like $100 bills. And he said he knew from looking at it, it was a cocktail napkin, and he thought how silly it was. But yet when the time came for him to grab those bills before the next person could get them, he jumped right up and grabbed them. And that's what we're talking about here. So unless they can somehow summon the willpower to overcome that compulsion, which is very unlikely in this case where the frontal cortex has essentially been overpowered, possibly even completely shut down, it's typically just not possible. And that's how this happens. The bright side is there are ways to strengthen the prefrontal cortex so that this limbic friction does not occur. And I'm going to talk about that in my next video. So that'll do it. As always, stronger, sober, and please like, share, subscribe. Thanks.